A bit of experience here behind us. Really impressed with tonight's turnout, so please, at any time, if anybody has any questions or comments, just raise your hand up so we can share that with everybody else in the group. Believe me, if you think of it, it's somebody else is thinking of it. Some of us are shyer than others, so it always helps if you share your thoughts or your opinion or your situations. The other thing is no problems are that unique. Okay, so if somebody's having a challenge or facing adversity with their home, I'm sure somebody else here is going through a similar situation. And this is what makes the seminar so great, is we get to meet other like-minded hobbyists, we can exchange some ideas afterwards, you get to network a bit, but we help each other, yeah? That's what we're here for.
Yeah, go ahead, have a seat there. Do we need more chairs? Does everybody have a seat? Yeah. We're all good? Oh, musical chairs, is that what we're doing? Okay, this will pay off at the end of the night, folks, so I'm glad to see you moving around. So before we're done, I'm going to make sure we got a surprise for you at the end of this. Okay, welcome to our fall shutdown seminar. And again, any questions, jump in there. And follow along with us in the handout. So what is fall maintenance? Who needs fall maintenance? Well, fall maintenance is a proper shutdown in the fall of your pond or winterizing your pond. Some of you folks might want to take your pond down completely and shut it down. Other people will want to keep their fish in their pond and run it all winter. So we're going to try to cover off both things for you tonight. So our fall maintenance is geared towards both hobbyists or enthusiasts. It's for those that want to run their ponds year round and for those who want to keep it seasonal. Okay. A good fall program or maintenance schedule will lead to a better springtime startup. It will also allow for a pond to, over time, become a more sound ecological system. It'll be more balanced and more steady. Every time you rip a pond down, it's like Groundhog Day. You start it back up, and every year's a bit different, so you have different challenges all the time. If you allow the pond just to go through its cycle every spring, fall, winter, summer, eventually it becomes an actual established ecosystem that's a lot easier to maintain, okay? Okay, the purpose of our fall maintenance is to ensure long-term health of the ecosystem. And again, fall prep for next spring is huge to the success of next year. And as we go through, more of this will make sense to you, and I'll get a little bit more detailed with it. With your easier spring startup, you have a more successful following summer with your pond. And mostly what we're dealing with here is invasive algae and water quality issues, where you're getting a lot of pear algae, beard algae, green or yellow pea soup water. These are the challenges we face. And a good fall shutdown or a good fall maintenance will allow for a better summer where you have less of that. And we've seen in ponds of our own, like our one out front there, it stayed really clear this year and clean for us. This is the 4th year or 5th year now in a row we've run it all year round. And that pond out front, just so you folks know, is 15 inches deep. That's a city bylaw. If we went any deeper than that, we'd have to fence it off because you're liable if little people or drunk people or whatever get in there and drown. So it's not very deep, yet we keep those fish out there year round. And we're successful, okay? So if we can do it in a 15-inch deep pond, you should be able to have the same success. Now this past winter, and I recognize a lot of you folks coming in here, so we appreciate your patronage. A lot of you have shared with us that last winter was a little harder than normal because it was really cold, long, hard, and there wasn't a lot of like breaks. So a lot of people had tragedies with their pond, losing fish they had for quite a few years. So we're going to fine tune a few things this year. Amazingly, we had snow show up last week sometime, so we got a little taste of what's in store. But if you're like me, born and raised in Calgary, you kind of roll with it. You know what comes and goes. So, okay, who needs winter preparations or fall shutdown? Well, I believe every hobbyist with a pond really needs to take this to heart. The importance of a nice fall program to ensure a long, successful running pond setup. Okay, the purpose of your winter preparations are to ensure survival aquatic life over the winter and maintain a healthy ecosystem. So again, if you're going to be bringing your fish indoors, I strongly recommend that if you're putting them into a horse trough or a large aquarium or a kiddie pool in the garage, anything like that, that should be set up and going already. And get fish in there. The number one thing that kills people's fish, that where they bring their fish in from their pond and winterize them, is they bring a lot of fish into their system inside and it hasn't gone through its nitrogen cycle yet. It hasn't established itself. Then you bring all these fish inside, and because it's warmer inside, your house temperature is going to be warmer. The fish's metabolism speeds up because they're cold-blooded animals, right? So their body temperature rises, which means all of a sudden they're eating more, they're defecating more, and then you run into problems with ammonia and nitrite. So if you want to establish an indoor situation for your fish that you want to bring in from outside, you should start doing that now, where you bring in 1 or 2 fish a week and only feed the fish once or twice every 3 to 4 days. Don't give them a lot of material to process and defecate out. And lots of water changes, like 20-25% water change 2-3 times a week, because you will end up killing all your fish with ammonia spikes and nitrate spikes if you just dump them into a tank all at once, okay? Guaranteed you're going to lose them. And I have people nodding. Okay? So it's a process that takes anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks for a tank to cycle. So if we go 6 weeks from now, we're going to be at the end of October going into November. And normally speaking, again, being a native Calgarian, and I've had this happen many a times when I was a little kid, I'd have the coolest, most awesome Halloween costume, then I'd have to wear a skidoo suit over it. Because that's how it was for us growing up in Calgary at Halloween. So we'd go trick-or-treating and we'd be covered in a snowmobile suit. So we know the cold weather's not that far away. Traditionally, by the end of October, we start to get snow and everything starts to freeze. So if you're going to bring your fish inside, start doing it now, okay? Get those systems set up inside. But I'd still encourage you to keep the pond. You don't have to drain the pond and shut it down. Couple of reasons why. One, if you leave it frozen or leave the water in there, because Calgary gets this thing called Chinooks. We didn't get a lot of them last year, but we do get them. So if you empty out a pond, especially a preformed liner, the hard plastic casing, what happens is we get a nice Chinook and the snow melts up top, even though the frost line goes down about 30 inches, the frost level. All that snow that melts gets underneath the pond liner, and then the next day it freezes, and as you know, water expands and it pushes everything out of shape. So if you keep the water in the pond, all that weight of the water will keep you from doing less landscaping the following spring, yeah? Because if it's empty, it doesn't weigh much, it's not going to take much for it to migrate and shift around from the frost and the freezing and then thawing and freezing during our Chinook cycles. If you keep the water in there, even if you've brought in all the fish inside, the weight of the water will keep that pond much more stable, okay? Then in the spring, once winter's done, you can drain it down for a nice scrub and fill it back up. But keep the water in there over the winter. Oh, yeah, no worries. Ooh, wow. There we go. Thank you. And there's a pen for you as well. Thank you. You're very welcome. Okay. Now the other thing what happens is when you have a winter prep, you're going to maintain a much stronger ecosystem within your pond setup. Okay. If you're running a waterfall, you can run it all winter, but I will warn you of this. What happens is, and again, we'll go over a few things here, and if you know some of this, great. If not, please pay attention. A lot of what I'm sharing with you is mistakes I've made personally, and I don't want you to have to go through the same grief I put myself through. So if you're going to run a waterfall over the winter, it's a really nice feature, and you can get some really nice, especially if you're into photography or outdoors, you can have a real nice experience with your water feature in the wintertime. But be aware of this, water freezes from the top down, not the bottom up, yeah? It always freezes from the top down. And we had it happen with our pond out front one year. We didn't pay attention, of course, as the waterfall started to freeze and freeze and freeze, while it created its own new landscape. So as the water's pumping it up, Now all of a sudden it's not returning back into the pond, it's following the structure of the ice, and now it's going out into the parking lot. And next thing you know, the pond's drained, there's no water in there, but we see ice over top, so we can't see it's empty. So be aware, if you run your waterfall throughout the winter, you got to make sure that water stays in your pond. So normally myself, personally, I disconnect the waterfall. I keep the pumps going, but I turn off the waterfall. Because if you aren't careful, that's what happens is the water starts to freeze on your waterfall, and then the water, of course, follows the course that it can, and it ends up freezing all over your yard. And because your pond is covered in ice, you don't see that all the water's gone, your pump runs dry, all the fish are freezing. So if you're going to run your waterfall, make sure you're constantly checking the water levels of your pond. And if you're not running a waterfall, again, I'm hoping you'll have a de-icer on your pond or a breather so you can see the levels of the water in your pond. Because the other challenge we have in Calgary is a very, very dry neighborhood. So evaporation in the winter is much more extreme than in the summer. Again, this is something most of us wouldn't think of, but when it's really cold out, that water disappears fast. It just, yeah, the air sucks it up. You know, this is why in the wintertime a lot of people get bleeding noses because it's so dry out. Okay, so your pond will evaporate really fast. So if you're not paying attention, you might think it's filled with water, but the water's all disappeared. So you have to, I recommend, check 2 or 3 times a week your levels of the water in your pond, okay? If you have to fill the pond up with water during the winter months, it's okay. The water in your tap coming out is going to be ice cold, but it's not ice, so it's still warmer than the water that's in there, so you aren't going to hurt the pond at all, alright? Okay, some of the things we're going to go over tonight are about debris and leaves and things of that nature, aquatic plants, the fish, the pumps, and the filters. Leaves and debris. Decaying leaves and debris will upset the biological balance of the pond. A lot of times you'll start to get tea-colored water or green water, which is often caused by decaying leaves. Now, what we want to make sure of is, again, just so you folks know, and I preach this to a lot of you, water changes are huge in your pond, okay? Like any ecosystem. If we look to Mother Nature and we see a nice, healthy, crystal clear environment where plants are growing and the fish are happy and the bird life and everything else, we're talking about rivers, we're talking about creeks, we're talking about streams, we're talking about lakes, we're talking about natural beaver ponds, things of this nature. All these environments have one thing in common. They get brand new water 24/7. The Bow River does not turn off. You know, McGregor Lake or Minnewanka or any of these lakes, they get new water all the time pouring into it. It doesn't shut off, okay? Now, if you find a swamp or a slough where it's really stinky and slimy and green, and the only thing living are mosquitoes and dragonflies, there's no water exchange there. So nature has taught us already, but with a very simple example, water changes are important. Now, in the winter months, you're not going to be doing them because everything's going to freeze up. But it is important throughout the open season of the pond from spring to late fall that you folks try to do about a 20 or 25% water change at least once or twice a week on your pond. Okay. The reason we want to do that as well, coming back to this, decaying leaves, debris, which could be grass, it could be that's blowing in there. It could be like we had this big snowstorm, so all the pollutants the snow brings down or rain brings down. Right. I'll give you an example. My parents built their house back in the 70s, and back then everybody had white stucco on their house. That was the in thing to do. Well, every year I go over with my pressure washer and I wash their sides down for them because it's just dirty. Where does that dirt come from? It comes from all the smog and the pollutants in the air. So when it rains, that brings it down. That's debris. That's nutrients, along with any organics like grass or leaves. Dogs get in there. Birds get in there when your pond is open to bathe themselves and have a drink. So all these different things will lead to algae problems. Okay, so what we want to do in the fall is we want to make sure we protect our pond. So there's protective netting you can get, which you'll see at one of the front tables here, pond netting. And just so you folks know before I get any further, you got 2 pages of coupons on the back. These coupons are exclusive to you people only. Nobody else gets them. They're not public. and it's just a thank you for coming out and allow us to entertain you and hopefully educate you a bit tonight. So everything on the table, you got savings on if you don't have this product already. The store does have to sell a little bit because I charge them a lot of money to be here. All right, so anyways, the protective netting. What we want to do with the netting is we put it over top of the pond so it protects it, especially if you're in an area where there's a lot of leaves, where you get a lot of debris falling in the fall, where all of the trees are shedding and that. It just protects that stuff from getting into your pond, okay? If you have a skimmer on your pond, make sure that your skimmer's nice and clean so it can handle the load of all the debris that's going to blow in there. But the easiest way is just to cover your net with some pond netting, and it'll keep your pond way cleaner. Remember, any organics that get in your pond and start to dissolve are going to lead to much larger algae problems next year. Okay? Algae grows off of nutrients. Algae is a single-celled plant. So all the nutrients that are held in the leaf of your tree, the leaves from your trees or from your shrubs, they contain nutrients. Well, as it dissolves in the pond, those nutrients are there for the algae to feed off next year. Now, the cool thing about algae in a way of how it's evolved is algae basically is a single-celled plant, but what's unique about algae cells is they can hold up to 100 times more nutrients in their cell than the water's capable of absorbing. So they can store a lot of nutrients in their cells before they need to use them. So as this debris builds up and all these leaves and grass clippings and everything start to break down in the water because you left it there or it's gotten in there, that becomes food for next year's algae, and boom, out of nowhere you're dealing with algae. And that's our number one challenge here in the zone we live in. We're zone 3, by the way, and because we're fairly far north. Come spring and summer, we have 2 real challenges we deal with. One is extremely long days of sun. Okay, algae grows for 3 reasons. It grows because there's water. Well, if I take the water away from your pond, you don't have a pond, so that's not debatable, is it? It grows because of light. It needs light. Well, because you folks live in southern Alberta, I believe most of you here do, well, you really can't help that it stays in June and July light out till 10:30 at night. Now, if I moved you in the pond down to South Florida or Texas, yeah, it'll be dark by 5, but you don't live there. So when you go online and you read these things, always look where the article's been written because it's not applicable to the zone or the area we live. And the third thing algae needs are nutrients. They need food to grow up. So the most of what we talk about tonight for fall shutdown and prepping for next year is going to be so we can prevent problems with algae. How do we do that? We remove the nutrients, or we set up competition for the nutrients. One of the main keys is keeping leaves, grass clippings, any debris that are organic from getting into your pond. So you can either use pond vacs that we do rent, by the way. You can do a nice clean in the fall clean. We rent the pond vacs here. Or get yourself a good skimmer net that you can start skimming out all the debris and leaves that blow into the pond. But they need to be removed. Leave very little in there, as little as you can as far as debris goes. Because as that breaks down, it's not going to hurt anything. And algae's not bad. It doesn't hurt anything. But it just doesn't look good. And most of us have our pond as a water feature so it looks nice and we can enjoy it. Okay. So basically, you know, drain your pond down about 25%. Get in there, remove any organics. So that's going to be leaves, debris such as grass clippings, algae that's in there, remove it. Any decaying plants that you put, like your lilies or your hyacinths or your water lettuce, any of the seasonal plants should be removed from there, because if they just rot, again, it just turns into fertilizer for next year's algae. And trust me, as soon as the snow melts, algae starts to grow. Algae needs the water to be 0.5 degree plus 0.5 degrees Celsius for it to start to grow. So just above freezing. Okay, so the way we combat is we limit the amount of dissolved nutrients in the pond. Okay, so we'll move on to the plants. We know we'll do that 25% water change. Get that debris out of there. Rent the pond back or get a skimmer net, but get all that debris out of your pond. Okay, there's basically different plants we have. So we have our hardy marginals and bog plants, our water lilies. Those ones there, we'll talk about what you do with those in the winter. And then, of course, most of the plants that we're allowed to sell in Alberta, or what you'll have, will be tropicals. So again, those need to either be brought inside to a solarium or a greenhouse, or a place that you can grow them over the winter months indoors, or you treat them as an annual. Okay, so your hardies and bog plants, they're like a perennial. So basically, you cut them back as the frost kills the green growth, and that might have happened already with the snow that we had. I don't know how bad of damage you each had individually, but just driving around the city, and went to the football game Saturday night, like, I couldn't believe the amount of tree limbs lying everywhere. It was sad, actually. It was pretty heartbreaking to see the amount of damage that snow did. So if you started to have any of your pond perennials, like your cattails, your water lilies, any of that were damaged by the frost, cut them back now. And basically you want to cut them back to about 1 inch to 2 inches above the pot. Okay, and then just put them back where they were. Basically, these plants will hibernate over the winter, and a lot of the zone 3 plants, like your cattails, like your marsh marigolds, your hardy water lilies, or your zone 3 water lilies, they're like tulips and daffodils and such. They have to freeze in order to come back again. Or they have to hibernate. They just can't grow all year round like tropical plants. Okay, so make sure you cut them back to about 1 inch above the pot, the stems, or remove all the frostbit part at least, and then replant them in. The water lilies should be dropped to the bottom. Floating hearts should be dropped to the bottom of the pond once you clean them. Yes, sir.
So you shouldn't drop things like cattails or marsh marigolds to the bottom to keep them from freezing. Leave them up near the surface so they'll freeze.
Let them freeze in on the shelf.
Okay. That's right.
The question was, he was asking, like, the marsh marigolds and the cattails and stuff, the side plants, should I drop them down to the bottom? I find I have better success if I let them, again, they have to be zone 3 plants, but that they freeze in on the shelves or around. They have to go through that in order to come back the following year, and they will come back. Okay.
I lost one because I think I did put it down and it stayed liquid.
Yeah, no, it has to freeze, so like a tulip ball has to. Okay. Some plants, like your grasses, so some of us, and there's fewer and fewer zone 3 plants we can sell, but some of your tall grasses, you can just leave them uncut. They actually, so like your cattails, for example, the irises, leave those up high, you don't cut them back. We're talking more about like your floating hearts, which are like a submerged plant. Your water lilies, those should all be cut back, okay, just above the pot, 1 or 2 inches above the top of the soil of the pot, and then redrop them to the bottom. I would start doing it now. Just look at the plants. If the leaves are starting to yellow on them, or they're starting to decay, so just leave them for a bit then. Basically, we use the R rule. R meaning any month with the letter R in it, they can be cut back. So September, October, November. There's no R in June, July, August. So just remember the R's. That's a good way of remembering when you should do your maintenance on your pond plants, like your lilies and your floating hearts. So you can do it now, or you can wait till October. It just depends how cold you want to be while working in the pond. Are you talking about the floating plants?
Yeah, like I've got lilies that grow to the bottom after do I cut them back? They're not in the pot.
Yeah, still cut them back to 2-3 inches, like wherever the leaves or the stems start to degrade. Because what happens is this, and you don't have to, but when any type of leaf or plant starts to decay, it's going to release all the nutrients it's holding. And that's going to feed all the algae and the sludge. Okay, so you want to remove that. And then the other thing too to think about with that is sometimes if the plant's trying to go into hibernation, or next year it wants to start up and it has all this decaying plant matter still attached to itself, that takes away from next year's growth energy. It inhibits that growth. Okay, and again, we're zone 3, so if you have plants that are zone 1, 2, or 3, they should survive here. Zone 4, if we have a winter like last year, they're probably not going to make it. Zone 5 through 13 will not make it, period. If we have a mild winter, zone 4 sometimes comes back. And wherever you buy your pond plants, it should have on the tags what zones they are.
I'll let you ask first and then I'll come to you.
I was just going to say, I've got the Bose carrots that you sell, the yellow green grass, which I think is zone 5. And I'm having to get rid of some because I've had it for about 6 years and it's so darn big.
Nice.
And it survives. I think I was just saying, but I think because it's frozen, and I planted mine just in the gravel, no soil.
Right.
But, so there's the odd zone. I agree.
Yeah.
Zone 1 to 3 is safe, but
yeah, like I
that
say,
should maybe be rezoned because it's hardy as hell.
yeah, that's quite possible. We leave that up to that's not up to us in the hobby. That's up to Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah. No, I know. It's just that.
But that's good that that's.
I don't have that same luck with zone 5 planted in the garden.
Your question? Okay, the question is, what if you put a water heater? And we'll define this right now. A de-icer is not a heater. A heater is where you're actually raising the temperature of the water. A de-icer is an item you're going to put in your pond that only turns on when the temperature goes below 0. It'll kick in. So like your horse trough heaters or your de-icers. So they're not really going to heat the water. They're just preventing the water from freezing. But if you put in a submersible like aquarium heaters, or you hook your pond up to, we have a couple of customers that have hooked their ponds up to like jacuzzi heaters, or for heating a jacuzzi up, that type of stuff. Then you can keep your plants out there no problem. But if you're talking about a de-icer, it's not the same as heating the water. So again, with the winter, with your grasses and your cattails and stuff, I find that if you leave them grown over the winter, that acts as an insulation for the next spring. Then next spring we'll cut them back once we've gotten through winter, but it acts as extra insulation for the roots of those plants. Or if you do cut them back, lay them on top, like the cuttings on top of the roots, so it acts as insulation. You tend to get better growth back then the next year, okay? Hardy water lilies. Lilies will die back on their own as the water cools down and the light diminishes. Make sure you remove again any dead pads or blooms or stems from the water. And once we get into our real cold where it's starting to freeze every day or drop down to like close to 0, cut the stems back to 2 to 3 inches above the base, okay, and drop them back to the bottom. Because hopefully your pond won't be freezing solid, so they'll just hibernate till next spring and then they'll come back. Our pond out front, our little pond out front, it's just thick with the floating heart this year. Like we haven't planted all those. That's like now the whole pond's covered solid almost, which is really nice. They just finished blooming. So again, all we do is we cut them back, and then once it starts to get really cold, I send out some of the staff too. Too cold for me. Okay, your tropical marginals and bog plants, you need to move those indoor and treat like a house plant. Make sure they have plenty of light. Again, zone 4 or plus. If you leave them outdoors, you'll have to treat them as an annual. If you do bring them indoors, you need to use full spectrum lighting on them. Just a regular light bulb won't keep these plants alive. They're used to full spectrum sunshine. So in other words, the difference being is we're talking about UVB part of the light spectrum. So I'll use myself as an example. I can sit in a room with nice lighting. I don't got to put anything on my head, it doesn't burn. If I go work in my yard and it's a nice sunny day, even in the late fall or early spring, if I don't wear a hat, I burn my head, right? So these plants are used to that intense type of light with the UVB spectrum of light. So make sure you get a full spectrum light that also has UVB in it if you're going to bring these plants in and keep them year-round indoors, where chances are they'll still die back on you, and that's the biggest reason why. The second reason being is people don't change water enough on their plants when they bring them indoors. You need to do the water. They don't like, because what happens again is algae being a single-cell plant, and this isn't a comment on anyone's belief or faith, this is just an observation that I've been taught through science. Algae is the first thing that will grow in any environment where there's water. When the earth was formed, algae and cyanobacteria were the first two things to grow. When you set up a pond, the first thing that's going to grow is algae. Not palm trees, you know, it's going to be algae. So when you bring your plants inside and you keep them in stagnant water, the first thing that happens is algae starts to grow, and the algae suffocates the plant. So by changing that water, doing good water changes, like 40% of the water 2 or 3 times a week on your plants when you bring them indoors, they're going to stay healthy and they'll do well. Go ahead. No. The question was, do fish need full spectrum lighting? Not at all. The ambient light, you don't even need a fish light on it. But the plants do, because their photosynthesis is how they produce their foods. Yes? Yeah, you can have the water pumping in that, but you still do the water changes, because the nutrients still build up. Okay, that's really, really important. Okay, and if you're going to leave anything outdoors that's zone 4 or plus, you're pretty much going to treat it as an annual. So I would recommend removing it from the pond so you don't have that extra debris creating nutrients for problems next spring. Okay, tropical water lilies. Okay, you can attempt to winter. Oh. Okay. You can attempt to winter over in a dormant state, remove and dry out tuber, store in dark, cooler places, and repot in the spring. So what that basically means, the tuber is the root portion of the lily. So if it's a tropical lily or a night blooming lily, nighttime blooming lily, you cut it way back, cut it down so the tuber is just left. Then you let the tuber dry out and you put it in a dark, cool place. And next spring you replant it, and most of the time they'll come back. Okay, but you do have to keep in mind you are going to be treating this tropical lilies as annuals, not as perennials that'll come back on their own. If you bring them inside, again, they're going to need really strong lighting and warm temperatures if you bring them indoors, your tropical lilies. Okay, and these are mostly of your lotus family of the lilies, or the nymphea family of the water lilies, which, by the way, we do bring in for aquariums. A lot of people like their aquariums to have the lilies in there, so there's a lot of fun you can do with it. Okay, your floaters like your hyacinth, your water lettuce, your duckweed, your frogbit, those are all considered as annuals. Remove from the pond and throw them into your compost. Again, they're very cheap to invest in, so next spring you get a couple of tubs for $5.99 a tub or whatever. Dump them back in, and they grow relatively quick for the summer and give you good coverage again. But don't leave them in your pond where they start to decay, because that'll just cause much higher nutrients again. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about the fish part of it. Any questions on plants or what to do with plants? No? We're good? Okay. And just to finish off on the plants, again, every year Fish and Wildlife comes out with a modified or updated list, and what's happening is more and more of the Zone 3 plants are becoming a non-starter. In other words, they don't want non-native plants to compete with invasive plants. So if they're Zone 3 and they're not native to Alberta, we can't sell them anymore, because they don't want them out competing native plants. Because what happens is this, and I'm not seeing anybody in this room tonight, but that came down to Pisces tonight does this, but we do see it all the time, and it's two things that happen that are a big no-no. Number one is people, when they're out camping and they're with their kids and their families, they catch critters like salamanders and frogs, and they come in, I need frogs and salamanders, or I got these nice plants. Leave things in the wild, please, pretty please, with sugar on top. And I'll tell you why. because a lot of these animals now are becoming what we call endangered or on the soon to be endangered list. And I can guarantee you one thing, if I bring home a nice little tiger salamander that I caught when I was camping, the opposite sex of that salamander will not show up at your house. Excuse me, I gotta breed so we can ensure we carry on our species. It doesn't matter how much love and care you give to that animal, you cut off its chance to reproduce. Leave it in the wild. If you find one in your backyard, leave it where it is. Survival of the fittest. But if you take it and make it a pet, it's never going to breed, and besides it's highly illegal, just so you know. But that doesn't stop people. Now when it comes to plants again, you want to leave them where they are. If you want, and I did this myself and it was awesome, it was a huge savings. I just went to the Alberta government. Now this goes back 16 years, so I'm sure it's gone up a bit, but you still can do this. I went to the Alberta government, I applied for a permit to plant my yard and to do the pond and that. And basically what it was, it cost me $25 at the time, 16 years ago, and I was given a permit that allowed me to take up to 25 shrubs, trees, bushes, or lilies on the Forestry Trunk Road 940. So I went and got pine trees, I went and got junipers, I went and got ground cover, and up near Swan Lake some lilies. I was allowed to take up to 25 with that permit. 25 bucks. I wouldn't even get one tree at Golden Acres for 25 bucks. Okay, so there's ways of doing this legally and properly, and when you do it, they'll give you a how-to and do's and don'ts of it all, and you can have a lot of success and make a day out of it. But please make sure you follow Fish and Wildlife's guidelines. It's really, really important. And the other reason we like you to do that is because if too many people deviate from the program, then they start to shut down other things like us having ponds. So, for example, now if you want to keep trout in your ponds, you have to apply to the government. Government has to come out and inspect your yard and get permission to it. And you're accountable for each trout. So if a trout dies, you have to put it in a freezer, call up Fish and Wildlife. They have to keep track of every single trout. And we don't want this to happen with goldfish and koi and other our zone 3s and zone 4 plants. So make sure you just follow the rules accordingly, okay? Now our goldfish and koi are naturally winter hardy. We recommend the ponds be at least 2+ feet deep, but you can be successful less than 2 feet deep. They need lots of aeration and filtration if kept in the aquarium. Minimum 3 gallons of fish. 3 gallons per inch of fish length is a natural rule. So if you have 20 inches of fish, you're going to need 60 gallons of water for those fish, okay? You can put them into hibernation if you want to put them, if you got a non-heated garage or it's hooked up to the house but it's not heated. You can put in a big horse trough. Those work really well. And you can let the fish, the metabolism, again, fish being cold-blooded will slow right down. So if you keep it at like less than 5 degrees Celsius, they should winterize without a lot of care and you won't be feeding them or anything. You'll treat them as they go into hibernation, but you have it indoors protected in your garage or your if you live out on a farm in Quonset, any of your big buildings, you can do that with. Okay, if you're going to keep the fish outside, fall feeding's really, really important. Again, you've got coupons in this, but there's the Hikari wheat germ's what we promote, or any pellet food that's wheat germ based. This is a much more digestible food, which means it takes less energy for the fish to digest this, and it builds up a greater wall of body fat that it can feed off of once they stop feeding over the winter months, because you're not going to feed them during the winter. If you add food to the pond in the winter, you're just going to be polluting your pond. There's going to be enough microorganisms and things and bugs and stuff growing in the pond that your fish will clean that up over the winter months. Okay, so don't feel bad, folks. And I say this because I know a lot of you care about your animals, but don't personify them. They're your fish. They're not a person. So they aren't. You don't need to feel bad if you're not feeding them once the pond starts to freeze in. There's enough stuff down there that they can feed off of. But to ensure that they'll make it through the winter properly, get them onto wheat germ, which you should have started already, but if you haven't, start giving them wheat germ pellets, okay? Once the water gets down to 5 degrees Celsius, stop feeding. Getting too cold for them to digest properly. One of the biggest things that a lot of people come in, and again the adversity or troubles they're having with their fish, is they start to get dropsy. Dropsy is when the fish bloats up and it gets kind of heavy looking and bloated, and sometimes the scale sticks out at the sides or they look like they're little floating golf balls swimming around. That's dropsy. That's because they can't digest their food, and now it's created an infection within the internal organs of the fish. Okay, it's like if you're a bird and you have a damaged crop and you're eating, well, you get an infection and you get like, because this is where they digest. So fish being cold-blooded, if their water's 5 degrees, their body's 5 degrees, it's not warm enough anymore to properly digest, okay? So once the water gets to 5 degrees, stop feeding them, because guess what? The fish's body's going to adjust, they'll go into semi-hibernation, and they're not going to want to eat a lot anyways. But if they continue to eat, because they are very, not the smartest creatures going, they might still try to eat, then you end up with problems like dropsy and other digestive issues, where the fish lose their swimming balance or they float upside down. Yes?
So if the water's above 5 degrees Celsius right now,
Feed them the weekend.
how often do you feed them that?
Okay, the question was, if the water's above 5 degrees, and you should all have a thermometer that you can use in your pond, how often should you feed? Again, I would feed the fish once every 2 to 3 days. Okay? There is enough natural stuff in your pond, they're going to be fine. I like to make my fish work for their keep. So, you know, I use a feeding ring so I can monitor how much food they're eating. So I'm not feeding the pond, I'm feeding the fish. Feeding ring's an important tool. And the other thing is, I like to keep them a bit on the hungry side, because then they get in there and they eat the worms and the bugs and the mosquitoes and everything else that drops in there. There's a ton of food in your pond. I had somebody last year at the fall shutdown seminar. They brought some of their plants in to show me, and when I swirled the plants out, you should have seen all the shrimp that came out of their plants. And they were like, well, I never added shrimp to my pond. Where those come from? Well, again, how many of you have taken a drive down the country road and you see that where there was water and now it's dry, it's encrusted with white calcium on top, and it's, well, all it takes is for a lot of these shrimps, they lay their eggs in there, and when it dries up, a nice wind comes and picks it up and spreads it. Now you got them in your pond. Or it could be from a bird that digested some of the eggs inadvertently through his diet, either drinking water or eating a small fish that had the shrimp inside, which had the egg inside, which, you know, used to live with the old lady in the shoe. You don't get that, do you?
Yeah, we'll have to explain that to her later.
Okay, even if your fish look hungry, don't feed them once it gets to 5 degrees or lower. You will just bring on health issues, okay? Again, I say this with don't personify your fish. Love your fish, take care of your fish, but they're not people. So don't give them people personality. When it gets below 5 degrees, we know it's too cold for them to digest properly. And if you, for example, cared about a family member or somebody that is a good neighbor or friend, and you knew that if they ate a lot of sugar, they would have real bad health problems, you wouldn't give them sugar. Just because you like them and they're asking, you still wouldn't do it. It's the same thing with your fish. If once it gets to 5 degrees or cooler, even if the fish come up looking for food, don't, because they can't digest it. Okay? Fish requirements to stay outside over the winter. Again, we recommend 2 feet of pond depth is to be ideal or more, but you can do it with less if you want. But 2 feet or deeper is ideal. What we need basically is we need overfill in the fall to allow for ice formation. We need lots of oxygen, and we're going to need gas exchange in the pond. Oxygen levels aren't usually a problem in the winter, especially if you're running an air pump. The colder the water, the higher amount of oxygen the water can dissolve. As the water cools down, fish respiration rate slows down. So their metabolism slows down, so they aren't using as much oxygen. But if the pond freezes over solid, they will asphyxiate because there is no gas exchange and they're not getting fresh oxygen. Okay, so an air pump and air stones going in your pond are huge for the success of your fish. And again, the water gets cold enough, it's going to absorb a lot of oxygen, but we need an area of the pond to stay open using a de-icer or a pond breather that allows for gas exchange. Otherwise, there's no escape for carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, these things, they just build up and the gases will overwhelm the fish, yes.
Is there a sort of square
Not really, as long as there's good gas exchange. Like I said, usually I find when we start talking about how we're going to winterize the pond, we're usually doing two things. One, we're going to have an aerator going and a de-icer minimum. Because what happens is, you know, if you only run one thing and that one thing breaks down on you and there's no backup, you're done. Okay? And I've done my research and I checked with 911, I checked with TELUS, I've gone online with all the latest social media. And what I figured out is that dude, Murphy from Murphy's Law, he lives in Calgary. Okay? He won't take long to show up at your house when you invite him. It's not like he has to fly over from Germany or come over from Japan or anything. He lives right here in Calgary. So we want to make sure we don't invite him to your place over the winter because he will show up and do damage to your pond. Okay, your gas exchange is the most important part of winterizing your fish. So decaying organic materials produce gases that are harmful for fish. So again, going back to removing all the debris out of your pond in the fall is very important. Because if not, what happens is that as they start to decay, they'll start to break down in your pond, and then they'll create harmful gases that your fish can't help but take in through their gills while they're trying to process oxygen, and you will get all sorts of stuff happening. Okay, gases that are toxic to the fish will be released out of the pond or distributed out of the pond when you have a good air pump going. Because as the bubbles pop at the surface, they're going to knock out all your other gases along with it.
How do you know what size of aerator you use for your pond? Like my pond's 8 by 8. This 8 by 8 by 2 feet. Well, how big does the aerator have to be?
Okay, the question is, how big does the aerator have to be for the size of the pond? It has to do with the depth of the pond more accurately.
So 3.5 feet deep.
3.5 feet deep, then I would go with a deep water pump. Anything over 18 inches deep, a regular air pump or pond pump, like the ones you see at the front table here, these pond aerators. If it's more than 18 inches deep, the diaphragms will blow out and they'll stop working. If you put them in an area of your pond, like on a shelf or on a brick or some rocks that you can lift up, have it about 12 to 6 inches deep under the surface of the pond, and that's all you need. Because water has pressure. The deeper it goes, the more pressure you have. So if you want to drop one down to the bottom, you're going to need a real deep water pump. And there's two reasons I'm more of keeping your air pump shallow. Number one is, again, I want my pump to last longer, so I'm not putting as much frac pressure on it. Number two, when we winterize our pond, what we're trying to achieve is we want to have what's called a temperate zone. So if this is our pond here, and this is the top of our pond, and this is at the bottom of our pond, 4 feet down, our frost is about 30 inches down. This water from here down is going to stay at 4 degrees Celsius because that's the Earth's temperature after you get below the frost line. So if I drop the air pump right to the bottom, what I'm doing is I'm taking that, what we call our temperate zone, the warmer water, and I'm mixing it in with the cold water up top. Now I don't have a warmer area for the fish to migrate and have a happier place to hibernate over the winter. All right, so if we have the air stones, like I say, 6 to 12 inches around the pond up top, I'm not drawing a lot of that warm water from the bottom down, but I am allowing for the gas exchange to occur. So ideally, you want your air stones to be 6 to 12 inches down for good gas exchange, but you still maintain an area of deeper ponds where you have that temperate zone at the bottom where the water will stay warmer than where it is up top. Okay. If you're gonna run a bubbler or a water pump, just have it near the surface to create a rolling boil of water. Again, it'll help in your gas exchange. It doesn't cost much to operate. Most pumps are fairly energy efficient, low wattage. But you want to have the pump off the bottom, not and the program that we got here from Aquascape says so you don't plug it up because a lot of debris gets down to the bottom. But again, because we want to achieve a temperate zone where we leave an area of the water near the bottom, like I said, the bottom foot at least, undisturbed, so that water will stay at 4 degrees or so, and that's where the fish will go and be most comfortable over the winter. So this picture here just shows you a bubbler. So bubbler basically is just your water pump where it's kept, like I say, 6 inches to 12 inches below the surface, and it's just blowing to the surface so the water keeps bubbling. It's much harder for moving water to freeze than it is for still water. So you can either use a pump or you can use an aerator. The reason I like the aerators is that they're inexpensive to run. They're not the same wattage as a pump. And if you have a pump, you can use both. The more things you have to winterize the pond, the better chance your pond has. And I get at least every spring when we come in, a good percentage of people coming in really devastated and sad because they lost some of their favorite fish, and it's because they just didn't winterize properly. So when we talk about oxygen, we need to make sure that the water is well oxygenated so the fish don't asphyxiate. They run out of oxygen or dissolved oxygen. The only way you're going to get gas exchange is by having an area of the pond open, and the best way of doing that is with an air pump. Okay, floating heaters. I don't like the term heater. They're not a heater, they're a de-icer. Okay, they only turn on when it's below 0. If it's above 0, they have a thermostat built into them, they turn off. They don't provide oxygen. They're just to gain an area to allow for an area of the pond not to freeze so gas exchange can occur. And it's kind of the last line of defense for your pond. Your step one's your air system or your air bubbler like a pump. Number 2 is your de-icer or your pond breather. Okay, and number 3, which isn't in here, is putting a canopy on your pond, building a shelter for your pond. Okay, and we'll cover that off here in a bit. But your de-icers, which are like these here, the traditional de-icers, which he didn't bring me up here, but they're basically a cattle trough or horse trough de-icer. The ones that are 1500 watts, they burn up your light bill like you would not believe. And they're not made to keep big areas open. They're made to keep a horse trough open. So you burn through them. And the other thing is that when you use your de-icers, if it's 1500 watts, you have to make sure you hook it up to an insulated extension cord if it can't go straight into an outlet, because they draw so much electric, you end up melting the electric cord. You can see where it melts all around it, but then the de-icer doesn't work that well. And also make sure you put a heater guard on it, so if the wind or the weather migrates that de-icer and it blows into the liner, it doesn't melt your liner. And again, it's something you need to check. I say this simply because, again, these are lessons we've learned in situations we've gone through. So every year it seems we get a couple of people that come in and they're really upset because their de-icer stopped working and they weren't paying attention and their pond froze in and their fish all died, and now they want to hold everybody liable but themselves for this tragic incident. Okay? At the end of the day, you and I as the hobbyists, we're responsible for going out maybe twice a week or 3 times a week and just quickly checking our pond, making sure the air pump's working, making sure the de-icer's working. You know, I used to have this argument with my wife a lot. God bless her, she passed, but I'd always get into this with her. I said, look, anything that works breaks. I don't care what it is. If it works, it's going to break. You have to replace your car towers because they're always turning. Your fridge door, you know, the little shelves on the inside, they seem to fall off for no reason, but you're swinging that door open and closed. If something works, it breaks. So if you hook up an air pump or you hook up a heater, it can break. That's what working things do. So you need to check on them at least once a week or every 2 or 3 days, make a quick visual. Because when you don't do that, that's when you've invited Murphy, and remember he lives in Calgary, so he'll show up right away, and you'll be one of these sad customers coming in, and I want the president's name of the company, I want your owner's name, because you guys have to, no. It's yours and mine responsibility to make sure our equipment's working, okay? Okay, so a combination of your air pumps, your water pumps, and de-icers is for best results. When you have all those items going, chances are really strong you won't have any issues, okay? And now I'm going to quickly go over, before we carry on, because this is not in the presentation from Aquascape, is tarp or canopy your pond. We get Chinooks in Calgary and then it gets really cold. We get extreme weather temperatures. The majority of what you're going to read online or that we have in these presentations, these are for sea level cities that where most of the people live. Where's our biggest populations? Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, areas at sea level. In the States, Los Angeles, New York, Miami, like the coastal cities, sea level. There's Calgary, which is high, there's Denver, that's high, but there's not a lot of the other cities that are really high up at this altitude. So we have a bit of a unique situation, okay? So what we like to do is we like to shelter our ponds, and the idea behind that is just the same as a igloo would do for our friends that live up north. You're trapping an area of warm air. So I find for best results, and I've had a lot of my friends do this with their ponds and they've had success with it, is you get a sheet of plywood, 4x8 sheet of plywood. Get a sheet of 4x8 white styrofoam, 1 inch, glue it to the styrofoam. And get some 2x8 pieces of wood and just build a box. So if this is your plywood, you just want to have your 2x8s go this way, right? So it's like a box. Have the styrofoam glued underneath, then you drill a small hole, like a 2-inch hole or 3-inch hole at either end where you can look at your de-icers and you can look at your bubbler working, and you allow for gas exchange, then you sit that on top of the pond. It's wood and styrofoam, folks. It'll float if the pond melts and there's no ice. But if it freezes in, that's going to keep that whole area under there open because it traps that warm air.
So you don't have to make a tent like that.
Well, I do plywood because it's simple, and I just throw it behind the shed in the summer, and then I throw it back out the next year. If you tarp it using like our favorite thing from Canadian Tire or Army and Navy, those blue tarps, then you would build it like a tent so you can sweep it off. Because if we get a heavy wet snow like we had last week, it'll just cave into your pond. You need to be able to brush it off.
Styrofoam won't hurt the fish?
No, it won't even touch the fish.
Just the white stuff.
Yeah, it's just insulating the air.
It won't hurt the meat?
Nope, because it's not going to touch the water.
Right, it's just a box.
So if you use the 2x8s, it's going to be 8 inches above the water. That's 8 inches of warm air. And then you run your de-icer, and you run your pump, and you run your air system underneath, and that'll create like a pocket of air that it won't freeze. Doesn't matter how cold it gets, it's not going to freeze. Now the outside of that'll freeze, and it might freeze in one spot, but smaller ponds you can set it over top of like a shell, or bigger ponds you let it float in one area. But it's not going to sink, it's wood. It's just going to stay on top, right? And then in the spring just throw it away. And it costs nothing to make, and it's such a simple thing. Okay, so if you build a canopy for your pond, you're going to do much better with it.
So just on that point, fish don't need any light.
No. No, they don't need the light. Because when the pond freezes with ice and it's covered in snow, there's no light. Right? And if you can even build a bigger hole, like 8-inch hole on either end if you want, and light will get through then. But the fish don't need light. The fish are hibernating, they're asleep. And their system's different than ours. Remember, they don't have eyelids, so they don't go like this when they go to sleep. They're like this when they sleep. So the no light won't hurt them at all. They just go into sleep mode. Okay? You want to make sure in the fall that you give all your filtration, both mechanical and biological, a good cleaning. Okay, if you're going to run your fish all winter, you're going to have your filters going all winter. You're not feeding your fish during the winter, so the last thing you want to do is be cleaning your filters in the winter because it's cold out. You just want them working. So give them a good final clean for the fall, put it back together, and they'll be fine till spring again. Okay, if we're doing a complete shutdown on our pond, in other words, we're going to deconstruct the pond for the winter months, what we want to do is make sure we take all the pumps out. Clean your pumps, check them over, and put them into storage. Now, I don't think they have it on this seminar here, but any water pumps, if you're going to store them, pump storage. Okay, They do have it on here, fantastic. Make sure you bring them in where it's not below zero, where it's warm enough, but make sure your water pumps are stored in a bucket of water. When you don't store them in water, the seals and gaskets dry out and then the pump will leak or it's hooped. Keep them in water, that's super important. Just keep them submerged. Okay, that's something that the manufacturers, oddly enough, don't put in their instruction manuals. So after a couple of years, your pump stops working or they seize. It's a good way of repeat sales, but it's not what I call full disclosure. I've learned over my 30 plus years in this business, if we keep you in the hobby and you're successful, you always want to do more. And when you do more, it's better for us because we're here to sell you more. Now, if we're all about just a quick sale and nothing works and you're frustrated and everything keeps crapping out and everything keeps dying, you leave the hobby. You take up train car building or crocheting or something, and we don't see you anymore. That's not good for business. So I don't really agree with the manufacturers not giving you all the information, but we do know that all your pumps have to be stored in water, okay? Okay, so again, make sure all your filters are removed and cleaned. If you're running like UV sterilizers or ion generators, we'll want to remove those. We'll start with our mechanical filters, so make sure you clean them out, take any debris out of them, clean all the sponges and the pieces of the filter like that. Take your cotton or your sponges or your mechanical filter inserts, just give them a good rinse and put them back in. Your skimmers, make sure you keep them buried and keep them full of water. Again, if they're filled with water and they freeze in, the weight of the water is going to keep them in their place. If you drain them out and you leave them empty, the frost in the water that gets underneath from the Chinooks and the snow melting and then freezing, that's going to migrate everything up on you. Okay, if you on your skimmers have your mats or your brushes which are built into your skimmer, just take them out, clean them, and then store them in a dry place so they don't get all funky and full of stinky bacteria over the winter months. Okay, pressurized filters. These are your filters that are like your have the sterilizers built into them. You put them next to the pond or dig them into the ground next to the pond. Make sure those are disconnected. Make sure they're drained, that they're clean, and they're stored in a warm, dry place. Don't leave them outside, because when it freezes, water expands, and when it blows that pressurized filter apart and breaks the sterilizer and everything, you've lost a good investment. Remember, your fish aren't going to be eating, so they're not going to be making a ton of mess. There's not really a lot to filter once winter kicks in, so don't disconnect that and just have your pump acting as a bubbler. Okay, makes sense to everyone? So if you have a pressurized filter, make sure you take them apart, clean them, and put them away. If you have a UV sterilizer, make sure you disconnect it and store it inside where it's warm. Okay, if you have a small pond like a preform liner, a lot of times it's easier just to shut it down, and by that we mean clean out your filters, put your sterilizers and that stuff, bring them inside, put them away. But keep your pond filled so it just freezes. Because it's like an ice cube tray. If the water freezes all solid, it's just going to push into the air. It's not going to hurt the liner. But if you empty it, you'll have to re-landscape it next year, guaranteed. Okay, if you're running it all winter, usually these are pond liners, like your flexible pond liners that we're doing this with. Make sure you just keep an eye on your water levels that we talked about earlier, so you don't have evaporation or your waterfalls freezing over that causes all the water in the pond to disappear. Okay, and look out for ice dams that build up anywhere on your streams or waterfalls if you're going to run the system all year round complete, because again, water follows the contour of the land. If you get an ice bridge or an ice blockage somewhere, water's going to divert, and like I said in front of our store last year or the year before last, when we weren't paying attention, guess what, the next morning we come here, the parking lot's like an ice rink, and there's this huge mound of water and there's no water in the pond. Okay, so even we have these challenges. Okay, here. Okay, so just something from Aquascape here. About 70% of pond owners shut down their ponds for the winter. Ultimately, you must decide whether it's worth it or not. That's up to you. If you're going to bring your fish indoors, do it now. Do it gradually. Don't wait for one day because you'll lose everything. That's really, really important to understand. Okay. But if you run your ponds year-round, I personally think the rewards outweigh the risks huge, and it ends up becoming less work every year for a year-round enjoyment. Okay. This is pretty much the portion of it that comes from Aquascape with their presentation here that they gave us to share with you folks tonight. I'm pretty sure the next one says see you next spring. There you go. Okay, so a couple of things I just want to quickly touch on that we have over here again is make sure if you're going to winterize your pond, get a couple of water changes in before the winter comes. Get all the debris out of your pond you can right now. That's super important to prevent algae problems next year. Okay, get your fish onto wheat germ pellets right away if you haven't already, so they can get a good buildup of food in them, nutrients and body fat to survive the winter. Once the pond gets to 5 degrees or cooler, make sure you stop feeding. Nail your pond heavy and hard right now with your bacteria to sustain the pond over the winter and give you a better start up next year. So 2 things we recommend, and again, these are things that we know work, so we want you to be successful, so you have exclusive coupons to you folks again. So there's micro lip, autumn and winter prep. This is a blend of bacterial enzymes that you put in, and you mix that in with our step 3 product here, which is, again, is a different strain. And the reason we're using different, we recommend the 2, is some of these bacteria are phototopic, which means they rely on natural sunlight to do their job, and other ones are aerobic, which means they rely on oxygen levels to do their jobs. A combinations of both do best. The reason they aren't packaged together is because they can't be put in the same dormant state together. They have to be, like the way they're packaged, for the bacteria to stay on the shelves for a long time. They process them 2 different ways, so there's nobody that figures out yet how to do both together, where they'll both stay until you put them in your pond. So there's 2 different types that you want to add in there, okay? Yeah, you use it all winter if you can. And again, the reason behind it is this is a blend of bacteria. These bacteria create enzymes. The enzymes are what do the work, okay? The enzymes are going to break down any sludge or gunk or algae. And just here, I guess I should do this now before people break away. Here, just 1 sec. Anyways, we'll do this now. What I did earlier tonight again was we were given some really nice water garden hardcover books here. So what I did earlier was I randomly went around and taped my business card underneath the chairs. So when you leave, you flip your chair over, and if you have one of my cards, you get one of these books free. Okay, so that's why I yeah, that's why I was laughing when you guys were switching chairs around. It's like, okay, because we basically were given these books, so we just wanted to have some fun with it. And I thought, you know, someone once told me I look like Oprah, so I thought I'd take one of her ideas. So we just taped my card underneath your chairs. So when you leave tonight, just check under your chairs. If you have my card, bring it to me, and we'll give you one of these books. Now, before we break up the group, does anybody have any other questions? Yes. Now, the question we had asked here was this lady, luckily enough, has some young fry, some fish that are about 1 inch long. Baby fish, will they survive the winter? Absolutely, yes. The smaller the fish are, the easier they can handle stress. The bigger the fish are, the less they can handle stress. So I'll take a small fish over a big fish any day to survive our winters. And again, while we're on the topic, next spring is when you're going to have your challenges trying to keep your fish alive. It's not the winter that kills them, it's the spring that kills them. Okay? So aeration is huge again. Keeping your bacterial supplements in there to keep the ecology of the pond is huge. But remember, fish are cold-blooded, so in the springtime, we can be in April and May, and we have an April day where it's plus 26, and then April, next 2 days later, is minus 20 again. Well, imagine if your own body temperature swung 40 degrees over 2 days. You'll be dead too, and that's not exaggerating, right? So it's really important, especially in the spring, to keep that pond tarped or covered until we get into the May long weekend. And once May long weekend kicks in, then you can bring your pond back to life. And I know it's hard for all of us that live here. Remember, I'm a lifelong Calgary. Nothing gets us more excited than that first swift, that first smell of spring, because we have such long, miserable winters that we just get excited and we want to get out there. But in the springtime, that's when you really want to watch things, because that's when you're going to lose your fish. It's not in the winter time. Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry.
I'm behind you, see, unless you've got eyes in the back of your head. I'm bringing my fish in. They're just little goldfish.
Right.
So in terms of, and I've noticed that they're not eating right now. So if I bring them in, I'll just treat them like little goldfish in the house and just feed them normally?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't need to get the bleach.
No, just feed them normally.
Okay.
But make sure you watch your ammonia and nitrite levels. Monitor those closely. You can either bring water in, we do free tests, or you can get the kits here and do it at home.
Okay.
And I'm going to recommend strongly you only feed them a little bit, like once every 2 or 3 days, a little bit for now. Because what's going to happen is once they're inside, they're going to heat up, they're going to warm up, the metabolism's going to speed up, and all that foods and food energies they're storing, they're going to process it real fast. So they're going to produce a lot of waste, which in turn will create a lot of ammonia.
Okay.
So you need to monitor that during the first 2 to 3 weeks. And the other thing is make sure you salt your tank down really good.
Explain that. It's salted?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so this is a question. We'll share this with everybody. This lady was asking about bringing her fish in this early. So if you start to bring the fish in right now into your house and you're going to put them in a tank, as I was explaining with her, make sure you only feed the fish once every 3 to 4 days during the first 2 to 3 weeks. Because what's going to happen is, remember, these fish are cold-blooded. You bring them in the house, now they're a warm environment. Their metabolism, their body's going to speed up, and all of a sudden they're going to be producing and getting rid of all that food that they were storing. So there's going to be a lot of waste created, which will make the ammonia and nitrite go up real fast. So you have to watch your ammonia and nitrite levels. The other thing I really strongly encourage you to do is that you salt the tank down heavily. Lots of aquarium salt in a goldfish tank. Because what's going to happen is when you bring fish indoors like that and it goes through a cycle, they get stressed. And just like any other animal, including us people, when we're really stressed, that's when you get sick. So the salt is going to help with two things. One, if there's any parasites that they're bringing in with them, it's probably going to wipe them out. So you'll keep the fish free of ick, which is a parasite. And number two, it allows for the fish to work, the fish's body to work without being so stressed. Okay, and I'm simplifying this, but just so everybody gets it. Saltwater fish constantly drink water because they're in such a salty environment. And when I mean they're drinking water, they're taking it in through their gills, through their kidneys, through vital organs, and that's so they don't dehydrate. They're constantly taking water in. Freshwater fish do the opposite. They're constantly expelling water, otherwise they're going to bloat. They'll retain water. So what happens is, if there's no salt in the water, it's what we call equilibrium. The amount of fluids and salts are the same. So now your goldfish, or any other freshwater fish for that matter, but especially goldfish and koi, they now really have to push and struggle and really stress themselves to get rid of that excess fluid. If there's lots of salt around them, osmotic pressure just allows for the transfer of fluids to happen without any energy being used up by the fish. And that makes it stress-free. And the same thing happens if there's parasites or fungus or bacteria that are toxic, like disease related to the fish. They dehydrate right away because if there's salt around them, all the fluids leave them real fast, and they can't handle that Whereas the fish having much larger cells, it's not an issue to them. So you want to salt your goldfish or koi if you bring them indoors, okay?
Do you use this sea salt or
Aquarium salt.
Aquarium salt.
Yeah, non-iodized aquarium salt.
Right.
Okay, somebody had a question back here? Yes. Yeah. Yes, your fish is smart enough because their body's going to tell them where the warmth is. No. Or treat them as an annual. I know that sounds kind of cold and brutal. Mosquito fish. But mosquito fish, paradise fish, no, they won't survive our winters. So normally I try to remove them, but if I can't, then I treat them as an annual. They're not that big of a bio load, they're only about that big. Oh, yours got that size? Then bring them in. If they're small little guys, then don't worry about it, but bring them in. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What's a good thing to use to clean the pond liner down on the drain pond?
Just use a scrub pad. You don't have to get it spotless. There's products like we carry that we have, like our algae crusher or dissolve or pond clean. Basically, these are all different forms of dry hydrogen peroxide. So they're heat sensitive. If the water is cold, it doesn't work. So a lot of people buy these products and it doesn't do anything. The water needs to be warm, and that warm water creates a chemical reaction that causes that powderized peroxide to fizz and bubble and separate everything like OxyClean works. But if the water's cool, it's not going to work. Yeah. Just a good scrub brush, elbow grease. Yeah, no, just do that. And a pressure washer works. But I don't worry too much about it. You know, always, you know, everybody has different ways of enjoying their pond. So, you know, all I care really at the end of the day is you're successful with it. Myself personally, I like the pond to have a little bit of algae and a little bit of gunge. Uh-oh. Any other questions? Yes.
I just forgot it in the excitement. Oh, should you be adding salt before the winter to the water if the fish are staying in the water?
Yeah.
And in your pond? Yeah.
Yeah. I keep salt in our ponds. Yeah. You don't need to add a lot, basically a couple of 100 gallons. We just have the pond salt over there. It's non-iodized salt. Right. If you take water from the Bull River and get it analyzed, it's salt in it. It's salt sodium. It's not enough you'd ever taste in the ocean, but it makes a difference to how the fish's body works. There's electrolytes, minerals, there's all sorts of things at a molecular or micro level that it benefits. Yeah. So we just have it on over on the other side there. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, bring your pond, bring your pond hibernating.
And then I have a couple of, I have 4 aerators there.
Yeah.
And my pond is in one section, about 4 feet, but the rest of it's shallower. Where do I put those to keep the fish from the window? Like, will it freeze if I put it on the shallow part, then that area will with it freeze, and then that part will.
Well, if the water's circulating, it shouldn't. Well, what I would do,
There, and I've got one of those in there.
what I would do with the air cells is I'd have one in the shallower end. Actually, what I would do with that is I'd get some styrofoam. So an airline is tubing through the styrofoam and have it go over the water.
On the deeper side.
Yeah. No, that's fine. If you're fishing, you don't want to mix that warmer water with cold starting doing water changes. Should we be adding salt or let it treat the water that you change? Does it do 25 gallon change for your port?
Yeah, but you don't let it freeze to nothing over the winter as.
No, salt doesn't evaporate, so if it's popping up evaporation, you don't have it. No, you basically drain, just treat the pond and the water you change. Okay, and I like it, like I say, in a pond situation, I like to put a cup 100 gallons. It sounds like a lot, but when I get my pond fish in here, the goldfish and that, they go in like a 30-gallon tank and I'll put a cup of salt in there. And you can actually see them go down and bathe in it. No. And if you're not comfortable, you do have to know things, right? Like it's not about, but it plays a huge role into how the fish's bodies work, how the gills work, how you know the exchanges of fluids work. There's a lot of things that, like I said, on the molecular level, the electrolytes that are in the salt, all these things make a difference. When the city processes water for us, they take everything out, good and bad. Some of the stuff you need to add that. Salt. Yeah. Oh yeah, they love it. Just put it in there. Just throw it in there. Salt is huge. See, where a lot of confusion comes with salt is people come into pet stores like ours and they see saltwater tanks and they see freshwater tanks. So they don't mix the two. But the reality is, if you check and take a water sample from any well, any creek, any lake, you get it analyzed, there's so much dissolved sodium in there. City water has been processed so it's taken, everything's taken out good and bad.